Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was December 31st, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico. And this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Compagnona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. I had a little bit of trouble finding a large number of documents for December 31st. Not quite sure why. I've already talked about how I think Violant is getting ready to travel, is too busy, but I'm not quite sure why there aren't that many for Joan. So I went with the one that is listed in his itinerary created by Daniel Girona-Llagostera. For a little bit of background about that document, that long itinerary, go look at the webpage for episode 4, or go ahead and listen to episode 4. This particular document, at the top of it, it has a header. And this is another Latin document, so again, it's a bit of a struggle. Actually, that's an understatement. This was a lot of a struggle. And I'll tell you why. Look at the header. It says pro manumissoria vict compt, something like vic comptem de insula, and then it might be a probata symbol after that, or it could also be an abbreviation for quibus. It kind of looks like both of those. So I think it's the probata symbol, but then there's that accent mark on the top that kind of throws me off. So I'm not quite sure what that symbol is. I went down a completely wrong path with this document because I thought that it was about some kind of manumission. Like there was a freeing of either a captive, like someone had been taken captive and was then freed, or it was a slave who was freed because there was slavery at this time. These weren't a very slavery-focused societies, though. There were slaves, but they weren't slave societies, which is an important distinction. A slave society is when everything about the society is arranged around the maintenance of a slave population. And that's not a good way to characterize, not an accurate way to characterize the societies in the Crown of Aragon at this time. So there was slavery, there were slaves, so I thought, possibly, but it's a little bit unlikely that Joan would get involved in the freeing of a particular slave unless there was something very dramatic. And when I started looking at this document, trying to figure out the place names and the people's names in it, it didn't look to me like there was anything that dramatic going on. And I gotta tell you, I had a lot of trouble figuring out the place names too. So we have in the first line Infans Johannes, etc. And then we have the addressee, the recipient. And it's 3 lines actually. Actually, it goes to the 4th line. And it's all of these different officials and leaders within these regions of Roussillon and Cerdagne, but I didn't even get that. So Roussillon and Cerdagne are at the beginning of the 2nd line, but I didn't quite identify them correctly in the beginning. I got to it eventually. So I was really trying to figure out also what was caneto. I wasn't even sure if I was spelling that right. It could have been caneto, or even with a C at the end, because the T's and the C's and the E's can all look really similar in this handwriting. So I really did struggle. And so I went to ChatGPT, and I will tell you that without the AI chatbot in this instance, I think I just would have had the wrong idea about this document, and it would have persisted as the wrong idea, because I found out a couple things that I had not even thought to ask about. For example, in the header, the word insula, that's the Latin word for island. So I really thought there was some island involved. I mean, you would think. But actually, there's a region, an inland region. It's kind of near the coast, but it's on the other side of the coast from Perpignan, the city of Perpignan, in what is today southern France, and it's called Ila. And then there's a town that's on the coast, and that one's called Canet. And so there's a viscount who had the title the Count of Ila and Canet. And that's who is being discussed in this letter. I would not have put that all together. And in addition, it was ChatGPT that came to the conclusion that this was a different use of the word that is related to the English word manumission. In this sense, what we're looking at in this document, the word manumissoria, has to do with the execution of a last will and testament. So what this document is actually about is that somebody had died. The person was Andreu de FenolletDate. Andreu de FenolletDate. Sorry, I actually had to cut out a little bit of the podcast there because I had never said that name aloud before, and I wanted to maybe do the double L as a Y sound, so Fenollet or something like that, but I think it's Fenollet. I think it's an like a English L, double L there, but I'm actually not sure. There's a lot that I'm not sure about, and hey, this document was a great way for me to learn some geography about the area of what is today southwestern France, and also the area around there was part of France. It was within a region of France that was, I think, not exactly under the jurisdiction of the French king in Paris at this time, but I'm really hazy on it. It used to be a part of the Crown of Aragon for sure until in the middle of the 14th century, when there's some conflict that's going on, and there's the King of Mallorca fighting against the Crown of Aragon, and the region of Roussillon gets kind of caught up in that. So basically, it seems like at this moment, Joan at least has jurisdiction over the place that is ruled over by the Viscount of Ila and Canet. Or maybe that's pronounced Cane. Goodness. There's just a lot in here that I'm learning for the first time. I don't think that this document is going to really be a lot of use for me in a direct sense. So I kind of looked at this because it was on this day, but I don't know. The major questions that I have about it have to do with what is it doing here in the middle of a massive moment for Joan. Maybe there was an urgent need in some ways. Maybe someone was like bothering Joan, like, you just got to get this done. You got to put your seal of approval on the last will and testament of this person in this region that you're in charge of, that's in your portfolio, and you just got to get it done. He's like, okay, fine, I'll get it done, but I'm really worried about what's going on with the succession that I'm involved in, not this like lower level succession that's happening in this other region. But it's an interesting kind of parallel that maybe Joan is thinking about, that here he is signing off on what looks to be like an orderly transition of power in this little region, and he's about to engage in a transition of power, and he's not sure how orderly it's going to be. So that's today's document, and I wanted to take a moment to step back from the document and to just explain a little bit more about the backstory of what's going on with Joan and Violant and the Crown of Aragon in the bigger picture. The Crown of Aragon at this time was a very powerful polity. It had territorial possessions all over the Mediterranean, as far away as Greece, and it was extremely wealthy. There were Catalan merchants doing business all over the Mediterranean, and they really were at a level in terms of their presence and force that could compete with places that you've definitely heard of, like Genoa and Pisa. And so and Venice too. At this time, the Crown of Aragon is, I think you could kind of say, like at its height of its power as a Mediterranean force. It's kind of downhill from here, and a lot of the secondary literature pretty much puts Joan as like the beginning of the decline, and we'll talk about reasons for that as we move forward. But the Crown of Aragon is a big deal. It's a power player, and that is why Violant is there, married to Joan. A little bit of background about Violant. She was the niece of the King of France. So her grandparents were the King and Queen of France. So keep that in mind. She is a solid member of the royal family. She spent a lot of her time in her childhood in Paris at the palace. If you know anything about late 14th century Paris, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, there was someone else who was there at that time who got to be very, very prominent and went down in history in a big way. That was Christine de Pizan. I haven't found any information about whether Violant and Christine de Pizan knew each other, but their childhoods overlapped, and they were both there at the court of the King of France around the same time. So it's really interesting. Violant was a choice that Joan made, and he sought a prominent French woman to be his wife. This was actually his third go of marriage, and I'll explain more about that in a future episode. But for now, it's important to understand that in the moment that Joan married Violant, Joan overrode his father's objections. Pere had wanted him to marry somebody from Sicily so that the Crown of Aragon could solidify its rule over Sicily, which was a little bit shaky at the time. Just so happens, though, that the person that Pere wanted his son to marry was his granddaughter, which is like really creepy and weird. But Joan, I think, was like, no way, I'm not doing that. And furthermore, I love French culture. Joan was a huge fan of the music and literature coming out of France. And so he wanted a French wife. And this is one of the major feuds that erupt between Joan and Pere in the decade and a half leading up to the moment that we're examining now. Pere was so against Violant that he wrote Joan a weird little poem about how bad of a person Violant was. And in the poem, he writes about how Joan was being tempted by the devil, like alluding to Violant being a creature of Satan. And so it gets really melodramatic and also very heated between Joan and Pere. So you can get a little bit more of a sense from that little bit of background about the family dynamics that are happening as this moment of transition takes place. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document, as well as the transcript from ChatGPT that helped me to figure out a lot of the stuff that was really I had no idea about with this document, as well as that little poem by Pere about Violant. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.